When we consider the reign of King Solomon, our minds are almost universally conditioned to visualize a golden age of unblemished prosperity, profound wisdom, and absolute peace. We imagine the glittering gold of the temple interior, the awestruck posture of the Queen of Sheba, and a unified kingdom resting securely under the favor of heaven. In the superficial reading that plagues so many modern congregations, Solomon is reduced to a flawless caricature. He is presented as a man who merely asked for wisdom and was handed a utopian empire by divine fiat. We treat the building of Jerusalem and the First Temple as though they were accomplished by a glorious miracle, a transition from the wilderness to the cedar of the throne room without human cost. But Scripture deserves more than slogans, and the historical reality recorded in the biblical text is far heavier and more demanding than our sanitized Sunday school narratives. If we are to understand the true nature of Solomon's reign, the actual socio-economic cost of building Jerusalem, and the terrifying theological tension embedded in the foundations of the temple, we must look closely at what the Bible actually records beneath the veneer of gold. We must rigorously examine the sweat, the crushing taxation, the political compromises, and the profound shift in Israelite identity that occurred during these 4 decades, because a shallow faith cannot carry a heavy life, and a romanticized view of biblical history leaves us entirely unprepared for the sobering warnings embedded in the sacred text. To fully comprehend the magnitude of what occurred in Jerusalem during the 10th century before Christ, we must recognize the monumental theological shift taking place regarding the presence of God. From the time of Moses until the reign of King David, the localized presence of the Lord among his covenant people was housed in a tent. The tabernacle was intentionally mobile. It belonged to a pilgrim people. It communicated a profound theology of a God who travels with his flock, a God who is not bound to a single geographic coordinate, and a faith that is entirely untethered from the rigid institutions of the surrounding pagan nations. When David proposed building a permanent house of cedar, God intervened. The Lord reminded David that he had not dwelt in a house since bringing the Israelites out of Egypt, but had moved from place to place. The transition from a mobile tabernacle to a massive stone temple in Jerusalem was not merely an architectural upgrade. It was a dangerous shift in the self-understanding of Israel. They were transitioning from a pilgrim nation relying on daily providence to a settled, heavily fortified empire. The perpetual danger of an empire is that it eventually begins to trust in its walls, its treasury, and its institutions far more than it trusts in the living God. Solomon inherited this massive theological transition, and the way he executed it planted the seeds of tyranny that would eventually tear the nation apart. We are explicitly told in the 5th chapter of 1 Kings that when Solomon prepared to build the temple, he did not rely exclusively on the resources or craftsmanship of the covenant people. Instead, he turned north to Hiram, the king of Tyre. This is a detail of massive historical and theological significance frequently passed over by the casual reader. Tyre was a formidable Phoenician stronghold, an international maritime power deeply entrenched in pagan worship, specifically the fertility cults of Baal and Asherah. Yet, Solomon formed an extensive alliance with Hiram, securing a massive supply of cedar and pine from the forests of Lebanon. We must consider the immense implications of this diplomatic arrangement. The holiest site in the history of the Israelite religion was constructed using raw materials supplied by a pagan king and harvested under the direction of pagan artisans. Solomon entered into a complex international treaty intertwining the economy of Israel with the economy of Phoenicia. The biblical text notes that there was peace between Hiram and Solomon. But peace with the world often comes at the cost of spiritual purity. In exchange for the timber, Solomon provided Tyre with staggering quantities of wheat and pure olive oil year after year. He was essentially exporting the agricultural lifeblood of the Promised Land to feed a pagan empire in order to build his architectural masterpiece. The economy of God's people became inextricably linked to the world. The cedar of Lebanon was the supreme, most coveted building material of the ancient Near East. It was renowned for its majestic beauty and remarkable resistance to rot. But harvesting this timber and transporting it from the high mountains of Lebanon down to the sea floating it in massive rafts along the Mediterranean coast to Joppa, and hauling it up the steep ascent to Jerusalem required an unimaginable mobilization of human labor. The Bible does not hide this harsh reality. It exposes it plainly for those willing to read with maturity. The book of 1 Kings reveals that King Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel. He drafted a workforce of 30,000 men. This was not a cheerful volunteer project. This was a strict state-mandated draft. It was the corvée, a rigid system of forced labor common in the surrounding pagan world, but entirely alien to the foundational identity of a people whose core historical narrative was their miraculous deliverance from forced labor in Egypt. Solomon sent these 30,000 Israelites to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month. A man would spend one grueling month in Lebanon engaged in dangerous logging, and then 2 months at home attempting to maintain his own farm before the cycle repeated. The nation was being fundamentally restructured around the demands of the state. We must view this national conscription through the prophetic lens of Samuel. Generations earlier, when the elders of Israel demanded a king so they could be like all the other nations around them, Samuel delivered a chilling prophecy about the hidden cost of a centralized monarchy. He warned them explicitly, saying, "He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage. He will take your male and female servants, and the best of your cattle he will put to his own use." The Israelites stubbornly ignored the warning, blinded by their desire for centralized military power and the illusion of security. In the reign of King Solomon, Samuel's terrifying prophecy became a concrete, inescapable reality for the common citizen. The conscription of 30,000 Israelites to cut wood in a foreign land was the heavy, undeniable hand of the state, reaching directly into the homes of the covenant people. Families were routinely disrupted. Crucial agricultural cycles were compromised. The free people of God were slowly being reduced to mere cogs in the vast machinery of Solomon's imperial ambitions. The glorious temple was rising on the heights of Jerusalem, but it was rising on the weary backs of an exhausted and heavily taxed populace who were paying the price for their demand to have a human king. Beyond the massive shipments of timber from Lebanon, the construction of the temple, the courtyards, and the extensive royal complex required unimaginable amounts of quarried stone. The biblical record states that Solomon had 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hills, along with 3,300 foremen who supervised the project. We are looking at an industrial operation of truly staggering proportions for the ancient world. 150,000 men engaged in the brutal, lung-destroying labor of extracting, perfectly shaping, and transporting massive limestone blocks. The text provides a fascinating and deeply theological detail in the 6th chapter of 1 Kings regarding the atmosphere of the construction. In building the temple, only blocks dressed at the quarry were used, and no hammer, chisel, or any other iron tool was heard at the temple site while it was being built. There is a profound intentional reverence in this silence. The site of the temple was kept absolutely quiet, maintaining an atmosphere of holiness and undisturbed peace. But we must have the intellectual honesty to ask the obvious question: where was the noise? The deafening noise, the violent clanging of iron on stone, and the crushing weight of the work were simply displaced out of sight to the distant quarries. The aesthetic tranquility of Jerusalem was entirely purchased with the hidden suffering of the labor camps. It is precisely here that we must address a painful, highly disturbing distinction made within the biblical text regarding this massive labor force. While 30,000 native Israelites were drafted for the temporary corvée in Lebanon, the vast majority of the 150,000 carriers and stonecutters were not Israelites at all. The 9th chapter of 1 Kings clarifies that all the people left from the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, the non-Israelite populations that had not been driven out of the land during the conquest, were conscripted by Solomon for perpetual, unending slave labor. The text is brutally explicit. Solomon conscripted the descendants of all these people remaining in the land to serve as slave labor, as it is to this day. But as for the Israelites, Solomon did not make any of them slaves. This stark distinction highlights a dark, systemic reality at the heart of Solomon's golden age. The magnificent city of Jerusalem was largely built upon a formalized system of ethnic slavery. The Israelites enjoyed the immense benefits of the empire, the security of the walls, and the spiritual glory of the temple, but the foundation of their civilization was laid by subjugated slaves. Solomon had fundamentally become the very thing God had delivered Israel from centuries earlier. He had become an ancient Near Eastern pharaoh, sitting on a throne of ivory, commanding vast armies of slaves to build his monuments. We must also critically examine the architectural priorities of Solomon's extensive building campaign. The Temple of the Lord is rightly remembered as the crown jewel of Jerusalem, but a careful sequential reading of the text reveals a highly disturbing imbalance in the king's focus. It took Solomon exactly 7 years to build the Temple of the Lord. It was, without question, a magnificent architectural achievement. However, the very next verse in the historical narrative tells us that it took him 13 years to construct his own royal palace. He spent nearly twice as long and utilized significantly more resources, space, and labor building his own royal complex than he did building the house of the living God. His massive palace included the Palace of the Forest of Lebanon, a structure significantly larger than the temple itself, featuring 45 towering cedar columns and containing immense quantities of hammered gold shields. He built a great hall of justice where he sat to judge the people, completely paneled from floor to ceiling in precious cedar. He also built a separate, extravagant palace specifically for the daughter of Pharaoh, his most prominent foreign wife. The architectural footprint of Jerusalem shifted dramatically. The temple, while glorious, was functionally incorporated into the much larger, dominant complex of the royal palace. The worship of Yahweh was being visibly subordinated to the administration and glory of the human king. The cumulative weight of this relentless building program, the inescapable taxation required to fund it, and the brutal labor conscription necessary to execute it, placed an unbearable fracturing strain on the nation of Israel. Solomon's renowned wisdom in administration eventually devolved into the cold tyranny of economic exploitation. The Golden Age was, for the average Israelite living in the northern tribes, far from the wealth of Jerusalem, a time of deep, simmering resentment and absolute economic exhaustion. We know this to be historically true because of what happened the very moment Solomon died. When his son Rehoboam ascended to the throne, the leaders of the northern tribes approached him not with congratulations, but with a single, desperate petition. They did not ask for more beautiful temples or more gold in the treasury. They said to the new king, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." The true hidden legacy of Solomon's magnificent building campaign was a fractured, bitter, and utterly exhausted populace. When Rehoboam arrogantly refused to lighten their load, promising to scourge them with scorpions instead of whips, the kingdom tore in half, violently and permanently. The physical stones of Jerusalem were magnificent to behold, but the social foundation of the nation had been entirely crushed beneath their immense weight. The physical building of the city of Jerusalem was inextricably and tragically linked to the spiritual collapse of its builder. The same pragmatic international diplomacy that successfully secured the cedar from the king of Tyre also secured numerous political alliances through marriage. Solomon loved many foreign women, taking 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. These were not merely romantic failures, they were calculated, deliberate political treaties designed to secure the borders and enrich the economy of the sprawling empire. But the Book of Kings gives us the devastating theological consequence of this pragmatism. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God. The man who had prayed the most magnificent, theologically profound prayer of dedication over the temple of Yahweh eventually built high places on the hill east of Jerusalem for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. The very infrastructure of gross idolatry was constructed within plain sight of the temple of the Lord. The brilliant architectural and administrative wisdom that built the great city was entirely corrupted by a fundamental spiritual foolishness that destroyed his soul. The man who built the house of God ended his life building altars to demons. We must aggressively apply this rigorous, unflinching biblical analysis to our own context, because the human heart has not changed a fraction of a degree since the days of the United Monarchy. We, too, are obsessed with building empires in the name of religion. In the modern church, there is a constant, incredibly subtle temptation to mistake institutional success, numerical growth, and architectural grandeur for the presence, the approval, and the favor of God. We measure our faithfulness by the sheer size of our buildings, the complexity of our organizational charts, and our perceived cultural influence. We are terrifyingly eager to form alliances with the methodology of the fallen world, eagerly adopting corporate business strategies and entertainment models, entirely convinced that we are simply using the cedar of Lebanon to build the house of the Lord. But we rarely have the courage to count the true cost. We rarely ask whose backs are being broken, whose families are being neglected, and what theological truths are being compromised to maintain the vast machinery of our ministries. We forget the lesson of Solomon. When we prioritize the construction of our own palaces, our own platforms, and our own theological empires, we inevitably and disastrously subordinate the pure worship of God. A church that fundamentally views itself as an empire will always end up building high places to the gods of the culture around it. It is only when we turn to the pages of the New Testament that we see the final, authoritative, and glorious resolution to the theological tension introduced by Solomon's temple. When the Lord Jesus Christ walked the stone precincts of the Second Temple, a massive structure that Herod the Great had expanded to rival Solomon's original glory, his disciples pointed out the massive stones and magnificent buildings with typical human awe. Jesus looked at the absolute pinnacle of religious institutionalism, the pride of the nation, and declared with chilling finality, "Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." Christ understood perfectly that the physical building had become a monumental idol, a substitute for true obedience of the heart and a barrier to the nations. He declared of himself, "Something greater than Solomon is here." Jesus Christ is the true temple. He is the ultimate final place where the holy God and sinful humanity perfectly meet. He did not build his kingdom with the forced labor of slaves, nor did he tax his people into submission. He built his church by voluntarily taking the form of a slave and bearing the crushing weight of our sin upon the cross of Calvary. He does not dwell in temples made with human hands, but he sovereignly takes up residence in the hearts of a regenerate people. We have been definitively called back from the imperial arrogance of Solomon to the humble pilgrim reality of the cross. We must think carefully, soberly, and deeply about what we are building with our lives and with our churches. A theology that ignores the harsh, uncomfortable realities of biblical history will inevitably produce a weak, sentimental, and easily deceived faith. We must recognize that true spiritual maturity requires us to ruthlessly dismantle the idols of our own making, even when those idols look exactly like ministry success, institutional stability, and religious achievement. The unparalleled wisdom of Solomon could not save him from the deep corruption of his own heart, and the magnificent, heavily fortified walls of Jerusalem could not prevent the righteous judgment of God from eventually falling upon a disobedient and idolatrous people. Our security is not found in the physical institutions we construct, nor in the political alliances we forge, but solely in the finished perfect work of Jesus Christ, the eternal King who builds his church upon the indestructible foundation of his own righteousness. I leave you with this question, and I urge you to consider it with the utmost seriousness before you answer in the comments below. In your own pursuit of a successful and stable Christian life, what worldly methods, compromises, or modern idols have you allowed into your foundation? And what must you tear down today by the grace of God to ensure that your heart remains fully and exclusively devoted to the Lord Jesus Christ? Think on these things. Study the Scriptures with reverence and fear, and may the Lord grant you the wisdom to live a life worthy of the high calling you have received in Christ.